everybody. Trying something new here. Shout out to a young man named Kanan Gonzalez. I watched a video on Facebook just the other day with him and his wife chatting in the car as they were driving, and Kanan doing some really bad lip syncing, but to some really good Christian music. A hymn, I believe. And I thought, wow, what a great idea. Why don't I mount my GoPro onto the dash, and I might be able to use some of the time I spend driving around. And I spend a lot of time in the car going from place to place, evangelism place to evangelism place, and tooling around town, running errands, that sort of thing, like everybody else does. But I don't have enough time to just sit down and make commentary videos, that sort of thing. That's something I'd like to do, so I thought, redeem the time! Make the best use of the time, and mount the camera here on my dash, and freak out all the other people on the roadway by talking to myself as I'm driving. And it's hands-free, so all you purists out there who just want to find a reason to get upset about something, and oh no, Tony's using a camera in the car. It's no different than having a conversation with somebody in the car. I'm paying attention, obeying the rules of the road. So, the other day I had an opportunity to have lunch with a young man who's leading local outreach, leading that aspect of evangelism for his church. And he's a young man that he's not too young. I mean, he's got a house full of kids, but he's younger than me. To me, I mean, if you're in your 30s, you're a young man. But he believes that open-air preaching is something the Lord would have him do. And the church he attends certainly approves of open-air preaching. And he is a leader in the church and tasked with leading evangelism in his church, so he's already doing the work of an evangelist, so to speak. So he would like me to shepherd him in open-air preaching. That always excites me. To have a younger man who's qualified to serve as an open-air preacher, to ask me to help him, that's a blessing. But one of the things we talked about during our conversation is, well, what would an evangelistic open-air ministry look like in the local church? He had listened to my sermon that I preached at the Herald Society recently on Have You Been Sent? An exposition of Romans 10, 14, and 15. And he agreed with the sermon. He agreed that men should be sent out from the local church, that there is two aspects to the call on a man's heart, a man's life to open-air preach. There is that internal call, that desire to open-air preach, to serve the Lord in that way. And then there is the external call, the call from the church, where the church would examine the man, qualify the man, call the man, and send the man to open-air preach. In that message, I talked about the importance of men who want to open-air preach, that even if they don't aspire to serve the church as an elder, that they should have the qualifications of an elder. We have no other barometer, we have no other litmus test for leadership and for service in leadership than what we see in the pastoral epistles. Anything short of that standard really is a man-contrived, man-centered standard. If we're not going to accept the standard for spiritual leadership that we see in the pastoral epistles, that's a very nice Mercedes that wants to pull right out in front of me. If we don't follow that standard, then any other standard we create is going to be less than what the Word of God prescribes for the man who would serve as a teacher, as a leader. An open-air preacher needs to have the character qualities, I believe, of a man who aspires to serve the church as an elder. And he must also have the ability to teach. Preaching is teaching. That comes out in the Greek word kerusso. Preaching and teaching, they are two sides of the same coin, or sharing one side of the same coin, however you want to paint that word picture. And so, as we're having our conversation, and as he's affirming what I said, what I shared in that message, then he asked the practical question. And I've been getting these questions too from others. Rich and Chris, my sidekicks on Cross Encounters Radio, they're saying, hey, I hear what you're saying in the message, but where do we go from here? Great questions. And so as we were talking about it, as we were fleshing that out, we started to put together, nothing formal, but again, just talking it out, thinking it through, we started to put together an idea for what the steps would be for a church to develop an open-air preaching ministry as a prong, as a tool in their overall evangelistic strategy. The first thing, I think the first and most important thing, is that the leadership of the church is on the same page. I think you have to start there. You can't have a divided council of elders. You can't have divided leaders within the evangelism structure of the church. You need to be on the same page. You need to recognize open-air preaching as biblical and as historical. Historical theology supports open-air preaching, but most importantly, of course, biblical theology does. The Bible is replete with examples of open-air preaching, from Noah to the apostles. And just in word studies, particularly of that Greek word kerusso, which appears some 60 times in the New Testament, it is very clear that there is a distinction made, particularly in the New Testament, between the role and responsibility of all Christians to bring the good news of the gospel to lost people, and the specific call on some men to go and serve Christ as heralds, public preachers of the gospel. Clear distinction made just in that one word study, really. And so again, I think the first step for developing an open-air preaching ministry within the local church is to make sure the leaders are on the same page. This is critically important, because if you have some leaders on board and others not, well, one, you have a divided leadership within the church, and that's never fruitful. That's never going to work. But also, if the church does decide to support open-air preaching as a legitimate aspect of evangelistic ministry, but it is a half-hearted approval, an acquiescence to open-air preaching, then if something goes wrong out on the street, the leadership of the church may balk, they may blink, they may turn their back on the open-air preacher. Say if he gets in some kind of trouble or gets arrested, gets injured, something like that. And I saw that happen firsthand immediately following my first arrest out in London, with the church out there in London. And so it's critically important that everybody is on board. That's step one. Step two, I think, would be to identify men in the church who may already be open-air preaching. If you're a small church, information may be readily available to you. You may know if you have one or two or zero men preaching out of doors. if you're in a large church, a church of several hundred or a church of several thousand, you might have several men open air preaching, doing their own thing, with the leadership of the church having no idea what's going on. So I think step 2 is to identify men who are already open air preaching in your midst. Step 3, which I guess could also be step 2B because it goes along the same lines, is to identify men in the church who either are sensing a call to do that, or men in the church who the leadership of the church might think, if we start this would be a man we would want to raise up to do that. There are testimonies throughout post-apostolic history where the church recognized a man's qualifications and abilities to herald the gospel in the open air before he did. The church had to come alongside, the leadership of the church had to come alongside the man to help him to see and understand that God may be calling him to do that. So identify the men who are already open air preaching in your midst, and then identify men who the leadership of the church might have that particular talent, gifting, temperament, usually important, and of course the qualifications to do that. The next thing would be to bring all of your open air preachers and potential open air preachers together. Once the leadership of the church has determined a course of action, a defined direction for their open air preaching ministry, it's time to bring all of the open air preachers together. Now, particularly in a larger church, if you have a number of men out there open air preaching, they've been doing so on their own for a long time. They attend a church, they're members of the church, maybe they're faithful members of the church, or maybe you see them on a blue moon or blue Sunday because they spend most of their time out on the streets and they're members by name, they're members on the roll, but you never really see them in the church. Whatever kind of man or men they may be, you need to bring in those men who are already open air preaching, and you need to explain to them, gently in a sense, lay down the law that, all right, we get the picture, we're on board, we believe open air preaching is biblical, we want it to be part of our church's DNA, and so here's how we're going to do it, and provide basically a standard, explaining to the men that each of the men, whether they've been preaching for 10 years or 10 months or have yet to step atop a box for the first time, all of the men are going to be examined by the elders to determine if they have the spiritual qualifications as well as the temperament to be an open air preacher. That is really the responsibility of the elders of the local church. It's not the responsibility of me, an itinerant open air preacher and evangelist. I'm accountable to my local church, and unless the leadership of the church places men under my accountability, none of the open air preachers out there in the world today are accountable to me for anything. So those decisions, those choices have to be made by the leadership of the local church. Now, the reason why I think this kind of meeting is important is because it is going to tell you, the leaders of the church, it's going to tell you right away what kind of men you have out there on the streets. If sadly they've already bought into somewhat of a nomadic existence where they're already comfortable being a loner, being a law unto themselves, answering to no one, going wherever they want to go, preaching whatever they want to preach, enjoying what they believe is freedom, and then they hear, oh no, the church has come up with a plan, the church is going to set forth some rules and guidelines, oh no, this isn't for me, and they immediately balk, or they complain, well look, I've been asking you to come alongside me for 5 years now, and And now you decide you're going to do it, but now you're going to try to take control. If you see those kind of attitudes pop up in the men who are already out on the streets open air preaching, you know that you have a problem. And if those men who are out there open air preaching, if they are not willing to humble themselves and submit to the biblical authority given over them through the leadership of the local church, then they're likely not the men you want as a church having out on the streets, representing first Christ, and secondly representing the church in the open air proclamation of the gospel. So that meeting will be very, very important. Now, once you've brought the men together, and some of these things they're overlap. The order might be a little different. There are going to be things going on behind the scenes, but the leadership of the church has to develop a working, biblical, equitable plan for qualifying these men. What will the interview look like? Do you want it to be an ordination, as it were? I know some Presbyterian churches ordain men who are tasked with going out to the streets and open air preaching. Is it going to be a commissioning? Is it going to be the laying on of hands? Is it simply going to be an affirmation? And what steps are you going to take to get there? When you qualify these men, how are you going to do it? I would suggest qualifying these men the same way you would qualify an elder. I know a number of really sound churches that certainly talk to the wife of the open air preacher if he's married, or talk to neighbors, talk to co-workers who are not saved, find out what his reputation is like, not only inside the church but outside the church. Does he have the ability to teach? Can he stand in the pulpit? Can he teach a Bible study, not simply facilitate a discussion, but actually open up the Word of God and teach the Word of God, whether sitting in a chair in his living room or in a classroom at the church or behind the pulpit? What is his home life like? Critically important. I've seen a number of men over the years shipwreck their faith and literally destroy their marriages by allowing open air preaching or street evangelism in general to become a mistress. They were committing adultery, and the mistress was open air preaching. They were neglecting their wife, neglecting their children to be out on the streets open air preaching. What is this man's home life like? If he can't lead his family, if he's not discipling his wife and his children, if he's not evangelizing his children, if they're lost, if he doesn't recognize his wife and his children as his first ministry, what would make any of us think that he's qualified to have a ministry outside the home? So that's very important. What level of Bible knowledge does this man have? Now, I think seminaries are wonderful things. My church, Grace Community Church, has what I believe is the finest seminary in the world, in the Master's Seminary. Seminary I attended for a time back at the turn of the century. I think seminaries certainly have their place. I do think more churches are going an even more biblical route in having their own seminaries within their own churches, discipling and raising up and training their own men to step into the pulpit or to go and plant churches elsewhere. But either way, each church has to decide what level of biblical knowledge, biblical understanding, what level of ability to rightly divide the Word of God does an open air preacher have to have. And again, that is entirely the purview of each individual church. And so once that is in order, and you may even want to have that all laid out before that initial meeting so you can explain all of that to your existing open air preachers and to the men who are prospective open air preachers. Once you have that done, then get to work, start raising up these men. I think it's really important that a man who aspires to open air preach is willing to clean the toilets or change a diaper or clean the pastor's office in the church. I think a man who wants to open air preach away from his church should be a well-known member of his church, meaning he is seen regularly. He is serving in one capacity or another. Yes, of course, he probably is involved in the church's direct line of evangelism. Yeah, that makes sense, but he should be serving elsewhere too. He should be part of a home Bible study if his church has those. He should be cutting his teeth on teaching, either in Sunday school or adult Sunday school, or if he is a learned man and already has some training under his belt, maybe even standing in the pulpit from time to time. And how long should all of this take? Well, that's entirely up to each church. I believe in the independence and autonomy of the local church to determine for itself how they're going to go about raising up their open air preachers. So those are just some ideas. I think as far as the accountability, once men are selected to be open air preachers, once they are ordained or commissioned or affirmed, once they're sent out either locally or to other places, maybe to come alongside a church plant in another community, another state, another country, there has to be regular accountability. The elders should be asking for audios or videos of the open air preacher's activity. They should be evaluating not only the content of his message, but his tone, his interaction with hecklers. All of those things should be evaluated. The pastors and the elders should make it a point, maybe not as a group, but individually, from time to time, to get out there with the open air preacher, to watch, to see firsthand, to be an encouragement, to provide exhortation, to provide correction, to provide instruction, to be there to pray, maybe even open air themselves. But there needs to be that kind of hand-on accountability. You cannot just simply lay hands on a man or commission a man or affirm a man and say, go. You have our blessing, you have our support, and we will tend to your wounds when you come off the battlefield each day, whether physically, spiritually, emotionally. We're going to be there for you. But you got to do more than just send them out and hope for the best. You've got to be monitoring them. You've got to be watching them. You've got to be grooming them. You've got to watch what other who else they're hanging out with. Whose videos are they watching? Are they gravitating towards really good open air preachers, or are they gravitating towards full-on heretics like the Pelagianists and the King James onlyists, the Ruckmanites as they're called, down in Florida? The elders have to be actively engaged after the qualification process is completed, after the affirmation, calling, sending process is finished. That direct connection to the local church and the leaders of the local church, that has to be ongoing. So just a few thoughts, and I hope this is an encouragement. Yes, to open air preachers, but more so, I hope it's an encouragement to local pastors who are maybe starting to think these things through for themselves. You've come to the understanding that, yes, this is something we ought to be doing, in addition to the other forms of biblical evangelism that we're already doing. Yeah, we ought to be doing this too. And you're looking at each other, you and your elders, going, okay, well, what do we do? Certainly what I've provided for you isn't a law, but I hope it's helpful. I hope it at least breeds discussion among you and your fellow elders, fellow pastors, and maybe raises even more questions. And would love for you to get a hold of me if I can help. Just email me at Tony, Tony, at crossencountersmin.com. Tony at crossencountersmin.com. And if you have questions or if there's anything I can do to help, to be an encouragement to you and the leaders of your church, I'm here to serve. So, been about a half hour of On the Road with Tony. I kind of like this. I think I'm going to do more of it. So, God bless. Have a great day.